Buying a home, it's a source of stability and wealth that can be passed on from generation to generation. At least it should be. The gap between black and white home ownership has been growing for decades. As that gap expands, it's become easier to trace its origins back through periods of racial tension and violence. Black families like the ones buried in this cemetery bought their own land, created pockets of wealth, really developing their own communities after the Civil War, really without a lot of help. This all happened in the early 20th century. A lot of those communities disappeared, like the one here in Forsyth County, Georgia.
My father always talked about owning land. It made you a man.
Elon Osby is a descendant of the Bagley family. In the early 20th century, they lived in Forsyth, a mostly white farming community northeast of Atlanta. By 1912, the Bagleys owned 60 acres and were one of the hundreds of black families thriving in the area. This is Denise Boyd. When slavery ended, her ancestors bought a small piece of property in Forsyth. Her great-grandfather, Joseph Kellogg, inherited and built up the land, and the Kellogg's became one of the richest black families in the county, even keeping up with wealthy white farmers.
Different branches of the family have taken what our great-grandfather taught my mother and the rest of the family, that whatever you do, do it well. And he had the only working sawmill in Forsyth County. And he was a church-going, easy-going man.
By 1912, Joseph Kellogg owns a 200-acre farm in Forsyth County and is the envy of lots of people, black and white. And I followed him year by year as he built that up. It was this incredible arc of backbreaking labor and, building a home and property ownership for his family in the most unimaginably difficult circumstances in Jim Crow, Georgia. And that's what was lost in 1912, and that's what was taken away.
In September 1912, an 18-year-old white woman named May Crow was beaten and raped. She died from her injuries days later. The backlash from the white community was severe. 3 black men and a young black girl were accused of the crime and thrown in jail. One of them was a 24-year-old named Rob Edwards.
The crowd went straight to Rob Edwards, who was cowering on the floor of the jail cell and crying. And they beat him to death with a crowbar, and then they shot him several times and dragged him out. And then they hanged his body on, we think, either a telephone pole or a tree somewhere near the courthouse square.
That was only the beginning of the violence. Groups of night riders terrorized black families, threatening them to leave. The Bagleys didn't hesitate, but the Kellogg family stayed for years before selling their home.
Eventually it got to Joseph, and that's when he just packed up my mother and them, and they left.
They were forced to leave. Their property was burned, homes burned, everything that they weren't able to gather on a wagon and save was lost.
Forsyth County was not an anomaly. Hundreds of counties expelled their black communities following similar patterns. White rioters lynched 3 black men and banished dozens in Pierce City, Missouri over the murder of a white woman in 1901. In 1909, white residents in Anna, Illinois drove out nearly an entire black community after a black man was accused of raping a white woman. And the 1921 massacre and erasure of Greenwood in Tulsa, Oklahoma began after a black man was accused of assaulting a white woman.
Those folks who had been successful became the targets for violent assaults. What the massacres do is they extinguish or they result in the appropriation of the wealth that was acquired independently by Black Americans in the aftermath of the Civil War.
These banishments had a ripple effect, denying the ability of these families to pass on land, creating a wealth gap. where the families weren't able to build on the success of their ancestors. Economist William Darity and folklorist Kristen Mullen say their loss of these communities was only the beginning. Black farmers peaked in 1910, owning nearly 19 million acres of land. In 2017, it was less than 5 million.
This ability to transfer resources across generations makes a huge difference in whether one is able to acquire wealth or not.
It's still unclear what happened to all the Black-owned land in Forsyth. Historians like Patrick Phillips are trying to figure out if families were even compensated after being forced off their land. He says some records show their fair sales, others show families were clearly cheated.
I don't see how anyone who can actually imagine themselves in that situation could find whatever occurred under those circumstances to be anything but a grave injustice. It's land that has changed hands many, many times, and ever more rapidly as the property values in Forsyth County have become more and more valuable.
After the violence of 1912, the county remained mostly white for over 70 years, a reputation that brought it into the national spotlight. The Civil Rights March in 1987 was organized to challenge the whiteness of Forsyth as the community began to diversify. Black families began moving into the county in the 1980s and 1990s. The racial tension showed that the people who grew up in the all-white county were still reckoning with their past. Today, Forsyth is considered one of the richest counties in Georgia. According to estimates, Black families make up about 4% of the population. And the small shift is having an impact. A community remembrance group working with the national nonprofit Equal Justice Initiative approved a historical marker for what happened here in 1912. For Denise Boyd and Elon Osby, it's a moment of recognition, but it's not enough. Their family's land is lost, regaining it is nearly impossible, and they are not alone. There are so many others whose struggles may not be known. Some of those folks may be buried right here. Their descendants are now lending a voice to their stories, hoping to speak louder than ever before. Their voices are joined by calls to make up for lost wealth across the country. One Black family is reclaiming stolen property in Manhattan Beach, California. A Black community in Pittsburgh is seeking retribution for a church destroyed in 1957. And a Chicago suburb is the first city in America to give reparations to Black residents.
I think that there should be reparations. There was a time when I didn't. I just wanted somebody to say, we're sorry. But I think that people deserve more than that now. That's just not quite enough.